taking place later today. So I want to stop here, but I just want to say this is maybe one of the issues of our time on human rights that is cross-cutting all regions that we've seen in various places. It's not confined to one particular country, but is part and piece of every country I think the Human Rights Council addresses. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. I will stop here because we have little time. And I'd like to start by giving the word to Morten Jespersen, the ambassador here at the Danish mission to the United Nations. And for those of us and those of you who work with the United Nations, I think you all know that Denmark for many, many years has taken the leadership politically on the torture issues, and in particular with the last resolution on policing and torture. And I'm very pleased to have you with us and drive us right into the center of the Human Rights Council. We may be virtually around the world here, but bring us into the council and make us complicit. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon to all of you, friends, colleagues. Ending the use of torture and other ill treatment, we of course support and believe is a key priority. It is for Denmark and for a number of colleagues and countries out there. And I would say for our part, not least because we are now during these years member of the Human Rights Council. We are witnessing a rise in the use of excessive force and police brutality when governments across all regions of the world respond to peaceful protests. Furthermore, the COVID-19 restrictions have made police and other law enforcement officials central players in securing public health and safety. Ensuring accountability in this context is an important step towards a world without torture. Therefore, I would like to thank you for your comprehensive report on extracustodial use of force amounting to torture and other ill treatment. While many of its findings are deeply concerning, the recommendations in the report provide concrete and actionable ways forward. Very much appreciated. We are committed to help states and other relevant stakeholders implementing these recommendations. In March this year, as it was mentioned, Denmark presented within the Human Rights Council a resolution on the roles and responsibilities of police and other law enforcement officials in ending torture. The Council adopted this resolution by consensus. This reaffirms, we believe, states' commitment to comply with their international obligations in this regard. States must now honor its commitments and establish a culture of accountability. This event we are participating in today is an important occasion for all of us to discuss how best to contribute to ending torture and police brutality against protesters. I would like to thank the OMCT and the Omega Research Foundation for organizing the event and wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and really thank you for your political support. I think we will need, this is one of the learnings on any human rights issue, to advance issues, we need friends, and I think you have felt for us for a long time as a very important ally and friend and bringing up these issues, notably through the resolution. Thank you also for mentioning something that I probably should have mentioned at the beginning. The OMCT with other partners has convened a briefing, which was an online briefing to the members of the UN Committee Against Torture and experts, on which basis we have published a background note with policy recommendations as well. And I hope that my colleague Helena can share this in the chat so that you can look at this as a reference material. But I think we should quickly try to get more of a panorama of the scope of the issue, the breadth of the issue, from nobody else but the Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Mezler, who has been very outspoken on this. And I ask you for the next 6 minutes, set us a little bit into the space. And where are we today and what needs to happen? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald. Is the audio okay? Thank you, Gerald. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, the organizers, for this very important side event. Throughout my tenure as the Special Rapporteur on Torture for the past 5 years, police brutality has been a special focus of my work. Already in my first thematic report to the Assembly in 2017, I addressed the issue of extracustodial use of force because I felt that it had not been sufficiently addressed as a matter of torture and ill treatment, but almost exclusively as an issue of the right to life so far. But obviously the vast majority of police violence happening, although there is lethal force, the vast majority still is of non-lethal nature, and therefore needs a conceptualization under a human right that actually regulates it. And in my view, and I think that's a view that is universally shared, the relevant human right really is the provision of torture and ill treatment. As the Human Rights Council has acknowledged in March in its important resolution presented by Denmark, public confidence in the police and other law enforcement officials is paramount for the ability to perform their functions effectively, and it depends on, inter alia, their respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human dignity of all persons. I think it's important to reiterate that the primary role of police is to serve and to protect, and therefore when confronted with unlawful acts of any nature, whether it's just minor misdemeanors or serious criminality, police officers must be trained, equipped, and instructed to show restraint and moderation, avoiding any unnecessary resort to force and coercion. Clearly, the use of force sometimes is absolutely unavoidable, and then law enforcement officials have a duty even to resort to force, but it always has to be governed by 4 basic principles. The principle of legality, which requires that a lawful purpose be pursued. The principle of necessity, that requires that the force and coercion used actually be necessary to achieve that lawful purpose, and the principle of proportionality, which requires that any harm that is likely to be inflicted by the use of force must not be excessive to the benefit of that lawful purpose that is being pursued. And fourthly, and generally, the principle of precautions requires that any law enforcement operation must be planned, prepared, and conducted so as to minimize to the greatest extent possible the resort to force and obviously also the resulting harm. As a 5th principle, we could also add there is a principle of accountability, obviously, that any violations occurring in that context have to be brought before the law and treated and sanctioned if appropriate according to and commensurate to the gravity of the offense. So, and what's really important from the perspective of my mandate is that any use of force failing to meet these requirements amounts to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. There's obviously a range of gravity which is enormous, from some simple insults which are not admissible but are already maybe degrading to all-out torture of people in custody. But it's very important that the police violence is the whole range of police violence is covered by the prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. And so in any deviation from those principles that I explained before, any one of those principles already amounts to a violation of that prohibition. And no exceptional circumstances can justify deviating from those principles. That is in line with the absolute nature of the prohibition of torture and ill treatment. States are obliged to regulate the use of force in line with these principles, to take effective measures with a view to preventing violations, and to provide victims and their relatives with redress and rehabilitation. And states are also obliged to promptly, effectively, and impartially investigate alleged violations and to hold perpetrators and their superiors to account. Now, in the past decades, it's an important point to make, we have seen a continuous trend towards the militarization of the police. Especially the global fight against terror has turned every citizen into a potential terrorist suspect, causing a dramatic shift of the attitude, equipment, and modus operandi in police forces around the world, away from the traditional role of serving and protecting towards fighting an internal enemy. This trend is extremely dangerous and has decisively contributed to a drastic increase in proliferation in the use of police brutality in all regions of the world, including in the context of protests and other assemblies. And now every day we are flooded with alarming reports and repulsive images and video clips of shocking levels of violence being used by law enforcement personnel against their own people, from Black Lives Matter in the US to political protests in Belarus, Hong Kong, India, Colombia, Venezuela, all the way to the protests against COVID measures in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, in Poland, in Australia, just to name a few. So this phenomenon has now clearly reached a global scope and has intimidated, traumatized, and antagonized large segments of society, and therefore has become a serious threat to human rights worldwide. Let me just mention that therefore on the 11th of August this year, we, United Nations human rights experts, have launched a joint public appeal calling on all UN member states to end police brutality worldwide. And let me be clear that failing to do so violates the most basic tenets of international human rights law, and in some cases may even amount to crimes against humanity. So any tolerance for police brutality of any kind recklessly undermines public trust, social peace, and the stability of democratic societies governed by the rule of law. For when law enforcement officials are permitted to behave like criminals with impunity, and when governments treat their own populations as if they were an enemy, then it is only a question of time until those populations will turn around and start to view the police and their own governments as their enemy also. And such a development, I think we all agree, must be avoided at all costs, for it will come at a price that we as humanity cannot afford to pay. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Nils, as always. Sharp in time, sharp in substance. I take a lot of things with me on this, and I hope you as well. I mean, the legal framework, obviously, there is a legal framework that is quite clear, actually. But also what you started with were the paradigm between police service and police force. And I think one of the trends we have seen is the move from a police servicing the people, facilitating demonstration, serving the people, to a police force and the militarization. Clearly, the COVID context has contributed to this because it has reinforced that role while it has cut the control side. And this is maybe where we want to move now. What can we do against these trends? What is the role of civil society? What is the role of national preventive mechanisms? What is the role of other standard setting or police oversight mechanism? I think we in the anti-torture world have been quite good on dealing with prisons and custody, but we have been much less good on dealing with policing, although it's probably the primary issue that we have to focus on as an anti-torture movement. I'd like to give the floor now to Luciana Pols, who is a senior fellow security policy and human rights advisor at CELS, the primary organization for human rights in Argentina, a network member of the SOS Torture Network. She's also a member of our working group, both on a crisis and COVID, where these issues will be discussed in our own network and in our counterterrorism group. But she is also, and I think this is her main role today, representing the International Network of Civil Liberties Organization, INCLU, with whom we are organizing this. And I think she will speak about what she has seen from a civil society perspective and how we can respond more effectively. So Luciana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gerald. We welcome the organization of this event and the opportunity to reflect on the application of the anti-torture framework in the context of protests. This legal body we believe, can play a key role strengthening the protections to a full exercise of the right of assembly, and the contributions of the special rapporteurs Nowak and Mezler have been key, and the developments at the CAT. And now the resolution, the 46/27, it's an important one to expand and implement the absolute prohibition on torture. We think it should be implemented jointly with the resolutions of management of assemblies in times of crisis and the resolution on structural racism and police brutality. But going to your question, we can say that this is most necessary, as we have seen during the pandemic in terms of state responses. The tendencies during the pandemic of concentration of power through emergency decrees and law reforms, disproportionate use of force in repression of protest, and Special Rapporteur quoted some of the examples, the use of less lethal weapons, even the ones that increase the risk in the context of the pandemic, like the tear gases. Also, the excessive and discriminatory implementation of COVID-19 restrictions has been one of the scenarios, the main scenarios of these abuses of force, and the criminalization of protest through fines, detentions, with 17,000 protesters, for instance, arrested in the US only in the 2 weeks following the murder of George Floyd. We have even seen forced evictions during pandemic in Argentina, in Kenya, in Colombia and South Africa. We welcome the interpretation of OMCT and the cut of the use of the anti-torture framework also in those contexts of forced evictions. Yes, this is happening in the context of the pandemic, and it's overlapping with some legal frameworks that are being problematic of favoring the abuses of force or occurrences of torture or ill treatment, like the states of emergencies, defining broad terms, sometimes with a not clear time frame of its operation. In many cases, we have seen the automatic renew of these exceptional regimes that we are seeing, for instance, in Honduras, opening the doors to the persistence of those violations, the trend of the security of militarization favored by the war of terror, as the Special Rapporteur mentioned, the war on drugs are being a trend that has been concerning in the last decade, I would say, or more, but the context of the pandemic has added the militarization of the response to a health crisis as well as one of the tendencies. And we have seen it through the direct use of military personnel in internal affairs, but also through the use of military-grade equipment and military-style training of police forces that also contribute to the militarization. In general terms, the assemblies, the management of assemblies have been associated with the notion of public order. Gerald was referring to the facilitation role of the law enforcement, but when we analyzed in different parts of the world some of the practices on the ground, we have seen the frequent infliction of pain or punishment to protesters with the aim of discouraging people to participate in protests, to aim of discouraging people to go to the streets. Among these situations, we can point out the extended and extremely aggressive practices of targeting the eyes with rubber bullets and other kinetic impact projectiles, with more than 400 victims in Chile in recent years, and also the saturation of closed spaces with tear gas, as we've seen it in the narrow streets of Cali this year, that have provoked the death of a baby and elderly people from different situations of asphyxia. We have seen also the use of live ammunition to enforce COVID quarantines, the use of whips and beatings. We have seen that in India, in South Africa. The death of Collins Kosa in Johannesburg was one of the cases that led to a court ruling warning about the militarist approach to quarantine enforcement and the risk associated with it. So to prevent the abuses, we agree with OMCT and Omega's reports on the roles of civil society being key, and in INCLO we have surveyed the responses from civil society in our 14 countries where our members are based. We found a rich variety of responses, and I invite you to take a look at the research, but just to summarize, I can say that organizations have used a combination of legal actions with monitoring and advocacy. And I guess 4 main goals of the intervention have been the prevalent ones: the actions to guarantee the access of social rights desperately needed in the situation of the quarantine, to request protections of vulnerable populations, like to halt evictions under the circumstances we were facing. And the last 2, probably more related with a framework of anti-torture that we are discussing today, had been the actions, legal actions or monitoring to prevent abuses in the use of force in situ in the protest, and also to protect journalists or legal observers to promote accountability. But because that is another thing that we have seen, is the targeting those actors who would be eventually the promoters of accountability on the ground. So these last 2 types of interventions can definitely be seen through the lens of the absolute prohibition of torture. And we look forward to the collaboration to develop this lens, strengthening the preventions on the ground for people who are demonstrating or protesting. So thank you very much for the time, and we look forward for the Q&A for more exchanges.
Thank you, Luciana. I'm asked to give a reminder. If you already want to type questions for Nils, Luciana, please do so. My colleagues will collect them as we go along. And thank you, really speaking also about the role of civil society. When we go to Colombia, we will speak about this as well. I think very important points that you raised on exceptionality. I mean, be it COVID or else. I mean, we've seen in the history of state of emergencies, whether declared or not, there's always the seepage of special powers. There's no reason why it concerns health. This should not happen here, and it does happen. And thank you also for raising the issue of who are the victims. It is very much protest, but it is also on a discriminatory basis. There is a social exclusion dimension, whether we are in India, whether we are in Africa, whether we are in Asia, whether we are in Latin America. But also raising the issue of the use of force. We will hear more about this. Personally, I've been very shocked on Chile and other places to see the blinding of people, which is in a dimension that is really breathtaking and shocking. And I think those are issues we have to respond to. I give the floor now to Maria Cedeño, representative of the Defend Freedom Campaign and member of the Comité de Solidaridad con Presos Políticos, one of our network members in Colombia, who have done quite extraordinary work on the Colombian situation. Please, the floor is yours. Enlighten us.
Muy buenos días para todos y todas. Gracias a la OMCT y a la Fundación Omega por esta invitación. Creo que lo que vamos a dialogar un momento de la perspectiva de lo que hablamos en Colombia no es ajeno a lo que Luciana estaba hablando sobre todo lo que ocurre en Colombia en el marco de las protestas sociales y de una otra manera que se hizo extensivo también algunas medidas en el marco de la cuarentena, que también hubo abusos de autoridad o abuso policial y que de otra manera en el marco estallaron y en el marco de la movilización se dieron muchas de estas. Voy a hablar sobre la defensa de los derechos humanos en el marco de la protesta social. En Colombia, históricamente, hemos vivido una violación sistemática de los derechos humanos en el ejercicio del derecho a la protesta, a través de un uso excesivo e indebido de la fuerza que ha dejado cientos de muertos. Solo en los 3 últimos años se han documentado 159 asesinatos y miles de hechos constitutivos en tortura y otros tratos crueles, muchas de ellas ignoradas por la justicia y el gobierno nacional. Por ello, hemos desarrollado iniciativas de monitoreo en tiempo real del comportamiento de la fuerza de la policía en la protesta. Nos agrupamos en la campaña Defender la Libertad es un asunto de todas. Aquí trabajamos en 12 departamentos del país. Nuestro trabajo consiste en tener grupos de personas defensoras de derechos humanos que se organizan en comisiones de verificación e intervención. Nos encargamos a través de estas comisiones de acompañar, monitorear y desarrollar un diálogo presencial en tiempo real con autoridades de policía para que brinden al ejercicio de la derecha, brinden garantías al derecho a la protesta. Para ello, nos toca ir protegidos, desafortunadamente, dadas las condiciones de protesta en Colombia, nos toca ir equipados con cascos protectores, cámaras, chalecos y distintivos que nos logren identificar. Porque ahora se ha hecho una práctica que el que defiende los derechos humanos debe ir plenamente identificado. Esto ha permitido disuadir a los agentes antidisturbios de usar fuerza de manera ilegal, pues están siendo observados por estas comisiones de verificación que graban y reportan las irregularidades a instancias de coordinación con autoridades estatales. Estas comisiones también nos permiten recolectar la información de primera mano, como la identidad de quien emplea un arma menos letal, la forma en que la usa y sobre la ocurrencia de otras violaciones de derechos humanos. Este material nos sirve como sustento jurídico y comunicativo para realizar tanto las denuncias por tortura al margen de las detenciones que puedan ocurrir. El trabajo realizado por las comisiones de verificación durante las protestas sociales nos ha permitido, o en este marco de estos 5 meses de paro que se vivieron en Colombia, nos permitió documentar 87 homicidios, 1.905 personas heridas. Ellas perdieron sus ojos. 106 casos de violencia policial basadas en género. 3.365 personas detenidas y 1.603 denuncias por abuso de poder, agresiones y violencia policial. A pesar de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, logramos que estas comisiones tuvieran reconocimiento jurídico, pues hay decretos en las leyes colombianas que nos permiten tener este reconocimiento. Encontramos que en la práctica de la policía, los escuadrones antidisturbios y algunas autoridades desconocen aún, teniendo en cuenta este reconocimiento por ley, nuestra labor, poniéndonos en constante riesgo. Solo en el paro nacional de este año, en el marco de la defensa de sus derechos humanos, registramos 326 agresiones a defensoras y defensores de derechos humanos, integrantes de estas comisiones. 129 recibieron lesiones personales y 34 fueron detenidas de manera arbitraria y en ellas se presentó un caso de tortura. Todo ello con el fin de obstaculizar nuestra labor de documentar la tortura y el uso excesivo de la fuerza policial. Por lo que nosotros consideramos desde la sociedad civil, pero en especial de las organizaciones defensoras de derechos humanos, que se debe realizar una reforma policial estructural que logre abarcar de manera progresiva una transformación de esta institución. En esta transformación se deben asegurar, como lo decía el relator, mecanismos de rendición de cuentas y de supervisión por parte de las autoridades y de la sociedad civil que nos permitan manifestar toda una serie de situaciones y resultados que conlleven a que no se sigan realizando este tipo de abusos hacia las personas que se manifiestan en Colombia. Por lo que consideramos también que a nivel internacional se deben de reconocer este tipo de iniciativas, porque contribuyen no solamente a que se sigan realizando este tipo de actos, sino a prevenir, documentar y denunciar las torturas y malos tratos que ocurren al margen de la detención de las protestas. Con ello, debe venir ese llamado a que se promuevan buenas prácticas en los estados y respetando de la labor de las personas defensoras de derechos humanos, que es lo que hemos reiterado de manera sistemática en Colombia, es que se respete el derecho a defender los derechos humanos. Eso es lo que viene ocurriendo en estos momentos en Colombia, en especial a los que realizamos la labor en terreno en el marco de las protestas sociales. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for giving us that reality and the dimension of the problem. I had to think about a discussion I had recently about some European countries. We have spoken more on other regions, but I think one of the things when we have some concerns about demonstrations, police behavior, is increasingly that public officials and politicians immediately before testing actually whether there has been abuse or not, publicly state that they have full confidence that the police is professional and others. And I think a more detailed analysis of this would be sometimes needed. And with that, I want to go to the monitoring mechanism that you described. I think it's a very interesting example to see how in Colombia this has been set up. But it has been set up with risks and threats to defenders, journalists, and others. I think this is also a reality we have to see. But it also has been set up because existing monitoring mechanisms often don't capture the situation. I had a call last week with European national preventive mechanisms, and very few, if any of them, do actually a monitoring role when it comes to extracustodial police torture. So there are maybe issues, and you said structural reforms and structural form of monitoring. And with that, I'd like to turn to Anete Erdmane, who is the human rights advisor and monitoring and response coordinator of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw, who come from a human rights insecurity context and who have worked precisely for a long time on standards on freedom of assembly in the OSCE region, but I think many of the lessons apply to other regions, and on the security and use of force issue. So Anete, we need allies. We are looking for partners who help filling this gap and this void. Tell us how you do this and who else has to come to help us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this splendid introduction and for the invitation to participate in this event. I do believe it's a very important topic to discuss, as you mentioned, specifically about instances of torture that we can sometimes witness, unfortunately, on the streets. And I think why we see it as a specifically important issue that should be addressed. Of course, not to say that these issues of torture should not be addressed in other contexts, but if we see these instances of police brutality and ill treatment on the streets, we can see how this can further affect the trust of the community in the police and how it can affect also other relationship between these structures of public authority. So from our side as OSCE, we see it very important to work to prevent use of force and prevent these potential instances of police brutality. As you mentioned, we work in the OSCE region, which covers 57 countries. And unfortunately, we have witnessed many of the issues that other speakers already mentioned through our monitoring work. I will not go into details about that. I will speak mainly about how we try to prevent and address these issues. And as you said, we do a lot of work through monitoring, and we see monitoring as one of the main tools in preventing these instances of torture and ill treatment. As office, we have developed a methodology on monitoring peaceful assemblies across the region. And based on the invitations from participating states, we come with our teams and observe the assemblies. Based on our methodology, we observe not only the assembly itself, but we observe things that are happening before and sometimes also after. And among the issues that we see of great importance is, for example, police communication, how the police is communicating with demonstrators, not only during the assembly, but also before, if there's dialogue office present, how the police is communicating through their equipment, through the way they interact, not only verbally, but in other instances. What is their interaction with organizers, and if they employ so-called no surprise policing, that the protesters and organizers would know in advance what to expect. And in case if there are some cases of tension, that it is the organizers can try to mitigate it through this ongoing communication with the law enforcement. And we have seen that in countries who deploy, and very often there are positive practice examples of police starting very early this communication with organizers, then afterwards we can see that these situations of potential tension can be decreased successfully throughout the assembly. So we observe not only this, of course, police communication, but also the planning of assembly, the intelligence gathering and other issues. And afterwards, we see how this is implemented during the assembly. We also, of course, interview civil society, as they have a very important role in facilitating peaceful assembly and other important stakeholders. And all these findings we then compile in regional reports, which we issue after this sort of monitoring cycle, where we include recommendations for participating states on such issues that we have identified pertaining to various issues, including also use of force. I will not go into detail about that because Matthew will speak later about it based on the latest publication we prepared together on different police equipment and use of force. And after our monitoring activities, we of course see that the second role that we see in prevention of cases of police brutality and torture is human rights education and training. And based on these findings, we have developed a course, a handbook and a course for law enforcement on human rights compliant policing of assemblies that we are also delivering to countries who invite us, together with our policing experts, which is discussing different kinds of ways how, first of all, which is our main goal, to prevent the use of force altogether, and if there's a necessity to use it, how it can be used in a human rights compliant way. Besides these activities, we also see, of course, a very important role of civil society in monitoring and engaging with law enforcement. So we train also civil society in our human rights and peaceful assembly methodology so that they can take over and further interact in their countries to take over this job and observe the police behavior and continue this ongoing contact. So we see that there are various stakeholders who are important in ensuring the right to peaceful assembly and prevention of instances of ill treatment. And that includes also local authorities, national human rights institutions, civil society, and the dialogue that is set up between them long before assemblies. So for example, I can mention, hopefully that will turn into a positive example with respect to Global Climate Conference now that is about to be organized in Scotland. The police there has set up sort of independent advisory body already since January this year, and are communicating on an ongoing basis with various institutions to see how to facilitate upcoming protests, climate protests in human rights compliant way. And I hope that this will also help them to ensure positive outcome later in November in Glasgow. So we see these positive examples across the country, and we try to promote them through our work. And as I said, this network of experts we see is crucial. And finally, of course, police accountability is of very big importance that we see that needs to be emphasized in the context of assemblies. So we always see that law enforcement officials should be identifiable, that they are individually accountable for their actions, including on the use of force. And this is one of the aspects that we discuss, and we see what mechanisms exist in the country if there is allegations of real torture, what are the effective mechanisms of remedy and investigation that an affected person can inquire and see and basically achieve a positive outcome and prevent further such cases. And I hope that I have managed to fit in my 5 minutes, and I am happy to reply to any questions that there might be. Thank you again. Thank you,
Anete. And really, I mean, those who want to ask questions, you have 5 minutes to think about this before we go to the questions. So please type them. I want to give the floor now to Matthew McEvoy, research associate at Omega Research Foundation, who has done enormous work on the use of force, the weaponry side, where maybe as human rights people, we are sometimes a little bit reluctant to go into, but we have to. And also on what are actually the monitoring mechanism and how do they work and or don't work. So the floor is yours. I mean, we've heard about communications a lot, about facilitation. How can these mechanisms actually play that role?
Thank you very much, Gerald, for the introduction, and thanks to the other organizations who were involved in organizing this event, and to my fellow panelists. It's been a pleasure listening to you, and thanks to everyone for joining us as well. I've spotted a trend during the panel so far. I think we're all in agreement about the importance of monitors, and that's a trend I will continue in my 5 minutes. Omega has been supporting the work of monitors now, as Gerald has just alluded to, for many years. And that includes monitors of assemblies, but also in places of detention. And we do this because monitors play such a key role in identifying problematic law enforcement practice. And of course, in achieving accountability for unlawful force amounting to torture or other ill treatment. And as Gerald also alluded to in my introduction just now, law enforcement agencies are the ones that frequently dominate the discourse around the public use of force. They're considered the experts in the area, and others are not seen to have the operational or the technical expertise, or sometimes even the moral standing to question police actions. But we think that this situation is highly problematic because it contributes to impunity and to a general lack of independent oversight. And effective documentation by monitors is one of the things that can help to revert this situation and contribute to culture shifts within law enforcement agencies, but even more widely than that as well, in terms of societal changes. But to carry out this type of documentation, a certain level of technical knowledge on the weapons used by law enforcement agencies is crucial. So I guess a question to those present would be, do the police in your city use kinetic impact projectiles or rubber bullets? If so, what type? Under what circumstances are police officers authorized to employ baton strikes? Or what type of batons do they use? Are they straight batons? Are they extendable or side-handled? These questions are important because each device has its own characteristics and the risks vary accordingly. Today, I would like to mention and to encourage you to read and to use the most recent publication that we've worked on together with ODIHR. And that is a guide on law enforcement equipment most commonly used in the policing of assemblies. I think my colleague Rebecca will share a link in the chat. And this guide shares some of the technical knowledge monitors need to accurately and independently document the presence of law enforcement equipment and the manner of its use during assemblies. It benefited from the input of assembly monitors from various countries, as well as policing experts. The guide is made up of 16 sections, each covering a type of equipment or tactic. I've seen a question, for example, in the chat about kettling. That's one of the sections in the guide. Each section contains photographs to enable monitors to better recognize the equipment in question, as well as a checklist with some of the questions monitors should consider when recording the presence or use of certain equipment. And we're confident that the guide, together with the other resources that Anete just mentioned, can help monitors to identify incidents involving disproportionate, unnecessary, or otherwise arbitrary force. And just in terms of practical tips, I was going to share some slides, but I don't think I'm authorized to do so. And I probably don't have time to do so anyway. But there are some practical tips and there are some resources out there in terms of documenting the use of force effectively. And the quality of photographs, for example, is very important. It's important to document the shape and size of devices using our cameras, particularly, where possible to record any logos, names, or other markings. Markings can look innocuous. They can look like a collection of random letters and numbers, but they can help us to identify manufacturers, for example, of equipment, which tells us where equipment is coming from. But if you are a monitor and you're at an assembly, do always be very careful around this type of equipment and don't take any unnecessary risks trying to handle it. And I guess the other thing I would mention, which Anete touched upon, is that monitors should attempt to photograph or video law enforcement officials deployed to police assemblies before tensions rise. This can mean just walking the streets around the vicinity of where an assembly is due to take place, because there are frequently additional officers out of sight of the assembly, ready to be deployed quickly if required. Documenting what they're carrying is important because it can become more difficult to do so later. And then just to mention, of course, the importance of video footage. Video footage of incidents of unlawful use of force has played an increasingly prominent role in litigation efforts to achieve accountability for the unlawful use of force during assemblies. Maria mentioned some good practice, so has Anete, and I just wanted to highlight another good practice by the Catalonian organization Iridia, who've used social media and crowdsourcing to gather pieces of evidence, pieces of footage recorded by participants around particularly egregious incidents to then use that in litigation. And I guess just to finish by reiterating the crucial importance of monitors familiarizing themselves with the law enforcement equipment that is used where you are based. It's essential that monitors are also aware of the rules governing the use of this equipment. And together this can help to guide your vital documentation efforts. I'll leave it at that and looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks, Gerald.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you. Indeed, I think we all have an instinct when it comes to the types of use of force and weaponry. We are sort of a little bit reluctant to go into this, so I think it's very valuable what you give in guidance there. And if I blink it back to the issue of restraints, but also the blinding and others, I think it is an issue where we as civil society too maybe have to educate ourselves more. Thank you also for putting this whole issue of monitoring structures. We had heard about civil society, but now about other structures as well on the table. I think there's a very interesting report by the Open Society Justice Initiative also on police oversight bodies and where it works and doesn't. Certainly an area to go. I now turn for a few minutes to questions. Please continue raising questions. I try to maybe reframe some of those that I've already seen, and I hope that not all of them are addressed to you, Nils, but clearly a number of them. One of those was on basically where extracustodial torture happens. We've spoken about COVID, we've spoken about public protests, but there is of course also the border context, the securitization there, the pushbacks and others. And I think there was one question in this regard. I think there was something, how can we respond and ensure accountability internationally on countries maybe that are not always in the focus. The mention was of Azerbaijan, for example, that don't have a country mandate or a specific engagement. How can also the Human Rights Council, because we're having this discussion ahead of this high-level panel on the Human Rights Council, respond to these type of situation? Or more broadly, what is our expectation of action from the United Nations Human Rights Council? We have other questions to all participants, I think more on the monitoring side and this conundrum of, yes, we need prevention accountability, but how do you break the blue curtain in a way that is there, or the corporate spirit that prevents accountability, and how can we move forward? One question was in that context maybe as well, we have all these laws now on torture prohibiting it, but we have hardly any convictions, and certainly not about the policing context. So maybe with that, maybe Jens, Nils, I start with you, and then please, the other panelists, let me know on which you want to come in. But maybe Nils, you go first.
Thank you very much, and I'll try to be brief. But I think accountability obviously is, the big elephant in the room. Incidentally, my current report to the General Assembly, which I will be presenting on the 12th of October, is on accountability for torture and ill treatment, because I feel that is the big missing piece. We have all the norms, we have all the standards, we have all the binding rules. I mean, it's use Kogan's rule and everything, but we don't have the actual accountability. And I think clearly it is very difficult if you want to go after individual police officers if the responsible government is not on board with this. If this government is on board, if they want to prosecute violations of these rules, then usually there is no need for us to intervene. So clearly we there have a sovereign state in between, actual accountability and our efforts. And I think there we really have to be realistic. I think it's a very important observation that police brutality is only exceptionally a consequence of, the misbehavior of a few bad apples. It's police brutality, just as torture more generally, or as corruption, is a collective phenomenon. It is it's not a rotten apple, it's a rotten orchard. And so we really it's a systemic problem, what I want to say. And so it really is not bad policing usually is not the consequence. It doesn't originate with the police. It is a symptom of much broader political problems, divisive narratives by political leaders. Take the COVID context, take any political context, election, protests and so on. So then those authorities use police forces as a tool to enforce their interests, and therefore they will also grant them impunity for abuse. So I think we really have to be realistic that the source of the problem is rarely with the individual police officer, but it's really a systemic issue that we have to address systemically. That's also why we appeal to governments for them, that is their primary responsibility to ensure the respect for these rules. So there is clearly there may be some instances where you have international crimes and so on, but again, in order to enforce that, you need the cooperation of the local authorities. Otherwise, it will never go forward. And I think so. It's important to have that big picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Since you were on the accountability side so much, I see that Matthew might want to respond to this, but also I'd like to hear from you. How do we overcome this reluctance of some of the monitoring mechanisms to actually go out on the streets and do the monitoring?
Is that for Matthew or is it for me?
For Matthew.
Oh, I wasn't sure either. Thanks, Niels, and thanks, Gerald. In terms of the reluctance of monitoring mechanisms to go out in the street, I think that's a really tricky one, and it's something that varies a lot from context to context, right? We've seen some of the bodies with official mandates in the likes of Colombia who have been criticized for the work that they've been doing, and I'm sure Maria could speak much more about that. I would say that one of the issues is that if we're talking about asking national preventive mechanisms to go and add this to the work that they're already doing, there is a conversation to be had about resources. In many countries, we've got very small mechanisms with a small number of experts, not in all countries, but where that is the case, in the likes of Brazil, where you've got maybe 8 experts in a continental-sized country, to ask them and to then go and begin monitoring assemblies is maybe a bit difficult unless they're provided with additional resources. But I think there's also an issue about perception, and this goes to the accountability question as well. While many of us who are present here are clear on the fact that torture and ill-treatment can happen in the context of assemblies, I'm not sure how mainstream that understanding is yet. And it's very important to change that situation. One of the things that we're doing is we're training judges, prosecutors, public defenders, even experts that work with courts, carrying out medical exams, in order to help them to understand that the excessive use of force, as the Special Rapporteur said in his presentation at the beginning, any use of force that does not respect these international use of force principles is in fact a violation of the prohibition of torture and treatment. Getting that message to those types of actors is one of the steps, and also ensure and looking at the complicity, looking beyond the individual officer who's involved in the use of force, looking at commanders, looking at things like the reporting of incidents. There are all of these things to look at. We could be here for a long time.
Thank you, Matthew. Unfortunately, the time is short. I just wanted to mention in the chat there, I think there's a link also to IRCT, some reporting guidelines for civil society. You may want to look at this. Anete.
Thank you. Yes, I'm aware of the time limit. So very briefly, I just wanted to mention about a reluctance to monitor. I think, of course, there can be many considerations, including safety of monitors in certain contexts. But I think one other reason for reluctance could be lack of knowledge, what to look at, how to monitor, and what is it that monitors are actually seeing, including equipment, but also other aspects of assembly. And I think that definitely can be done by training and providing training on assembly monitoring, something that we do. And also I saw in the chat there were discussions if there are templates on how to fill in about assembly monitoring. There in the handbook that already colleagues shared in the chat, there is also a reporting form that we use for monitoring our assemblies, which is then later merged into a report. So I'm sure different organizations have different purposes for monitoring, so that might not fit for anyone, but at least for assembly monitoring, you can definitely check the handbook, and inside there you will find at least the form that we use, which could be maybe adjusted there. Thanks.
Thank you, Anete. I have the two other panelists, Luciana and Maria. If there are last questions, I really ask everybody, for the matter of time, it's the most efficient way to place your question in the chat, and then the last round of comments can respond to those. Maria and Luciana.
Thank you. No, just wanted to complement to all the things said about the monitoring, that I think also the civil society role is to analyze and to push for the review of the legal frameworks that open the door to these violations to happen in the context of protest. And I see, of course, they are also the important role of the Council and the special rapporteurs. So of the things we have discussed today, the role of the frameworks of the exceptional regimes, the militarization of the security, also what Maria mentioned on the lack of police reform in some Arab countries, are all factors that would favor the occurrence of the event and then the lack of accountability in them. So we need to tackle the things that happens on the ground and the legal framework that favor them at the same time. It's a complex work, and that is why it requires the collaboration of different actors to do it.
Maria.
Sí, muy brevemente, es decir, efectivamente que esta rendición de cuenta en Colombia existe por ley, pero no hay algo que permita una responsabilidad de la institución. Aquí la responsabilidad, como decía Máximo, lo hacen de carácter individual, la trasladan simplemente al policía, no a la institución. Al hacer esta rendición de cuentas, donde se pueda demostrar una responsabilidad de toda la institución, va a demostrar debilidad. Y al demostrar debilidad, ellos van a verse muy disminuidos, muy poco respetados. a nivel de la sociedad civil. Entonces yo creo que cuando Colombia realmente, las instituciones y el gobierno acepte que está equivocado, que viene realizando este tipo de prácticas que afectan a la sociedad civil y que se vienen generando muy malas prácticas en atención a los manifestantes, mientras no acepte, vamos a seguir viendo un panorama bastante crítico para las personas en el país que tienen ese derecho legítimo a la manifestación, pero también cuando no acepten que estos mecanismos de monitoreo no son algo en contra de ellos, sino para que permiten mostrar cuál es el error y qué pueden mejorar adelante, porque aquí no se está realizando. A nosotros los monitores, como le decíamos, o a las comisiones, nos dejaron de realizar, nos sacaron de hacer esas revisiones previas que pueden generar o pueden hacer prevención frente a la utilización de esas armas letales o menos letales, como pueden utilizarse. Entonces yo creo que aquí se evita, es una rendición de cuenta estatal, efectivamente, para no demostrar en el error en que se están cayendo y que están por fuera de una otra manera por ley y que deben mejorar. Yo creo que ese es un gran error que tienen aquí.
Thank you, Maria. I think we have come more or less to an end. I see that, Leyla, you still have the hand open. Can you ask your question in 30 seconds maximum, because we have to finish?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Gerald. I listened Mr. Mezler, and he told that it's necessary to cooperate with the government. But how to cooperate with the dictator regimes? In Belarus, in Azerbaijan, just horrible dictatorship. And they told to policemen, killed people, not only torch, but killed after tortures. And how to cooperate with them? Unfortunately, no attention from international community to this dictator's regime. Thanks. Think about this.
Thank you, Leyla. I think Nils spoke about you need political will to engage in a communication and facilitation model. If the problem is the lack of political will because the repression is wanted, or if policing is about controlling communities rather than serving the public, of course, this is a key conundrum. I've seen that there was one comment I think quite interesting, maybe not to retake in the questions or the final points, but some colleague from Germany mentioned the historic baggage that some of the policing, of course, carries, and the legacies that are part of addressing police reforms, etc. I think we would probably all agreeing. I want to finish this by simply doing my one wish-free round. We are the pre-game show, I said at the beginning, before the Human Rights Council has a high-level panel speaking in a very cultivated way about the right to protest and the different dimensions. If we have one wish-free about what we want to see from this Human Rights Council on this issue, what is it? I asked my panelists for their final one wish. Nils, you want to start?
Oh,
Sorry,
it's difficult to reduce the...
Leyla, I think we are in the final
will be recognized as guilty and punishment for the tortures. Another people, another policeman will stop.
Thank you, Leyla. Let's have the final word from the panelists, please.
Thank you, Gerald. And just one very short remark. I didn't obviously not suggest that we have to be complacent with dictatorships. I'm just saying that if you're dealing with a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime, there's no point in trying to address the individual police officer. Then you have to address it on the level of the system of that regime. And we all know that this is obviously a particular challenge, which obviously would go, I think, even beyond what we can discuss and resolve here. But well, I think my greatest wish is that in the Human Rights Council, that it consists of states, that they recognize that it's their responsibility to prevent this dangerous development from escalating. by encouraging each other and recognizing that it's up to them to choose the means, that they're non-violent means and policies, and engage in proactive communication also with segments of society that they do not agree with, protesters against COVID measures and so on. And that is very important. They are part of their populations. They need to be brought aboard and have a, facilitate and promote dialogue. That's the only solution. Violence is not the answer. Thank you very much.
Luciana, for your work, what do you need from the Human Rights Council?
Yes, we need to recognize the true nature of a very complex protest that we are facing. Sometimes there are events of violence in protest that cannot suspend the guarantees and the protections for the rest of the protesters, for the bystanders. So we need to talk about the protest that happens, not only the formulation of peaceful assembly. We need to extend the protections, and the absolute protection of torture has that interesting side that will prevent always. So to work that, and I repeat what I said at the beginning, for the Council to recognize that they need to work this agenda jointly with the management of assemblies, the structural racism and police brutality agenda. They need to merge those works and analyze the complex situations that are in front of us in all the aspects. Thanks.
Thank you, Luciana. Maria, you wish free.
Pues nuestro deseo es que cese la impunidad frente a este tipo de hechos atroces, que cesen estos hechos de tortura en el marco de un derecho legítimo a la protesta social, pero en especial que nos dejen defender los derechos humanos. Es nuestro especial pedido aquí en Colombia.
Thank you. Anete, how to make the OSCE a freedom of assembly zone with a torture-free response?
I think that the main wish that I would have, and I think it was already mentioned by other speakers, is to convey the message and basically to give this notion that right to freedom of peaceful assembly, it's not a privilege, it's a right. And it is something that states have the duty to facilitate instead of limit, regulate, or have any other kind of forceful response. And I think by seeing that how to really facilitate this right, including through dialogue, discussing through civil society, law enforcement, I think that is the only way how to really make it work. Otherwise, we see on some occasions that also law enforcement police may be scared simply from unexpected or lack of equipment or unexpected outcomings of assembly and threatened by other issues. But I think that this communication is the only way, and through understanding that this is a right, yes, that needs to be facilitated.
Matthew, the final word is with you.
No pressure. I would just go back to the issue of the systematic abusive use of force, systematic unlawful use of force, the rotten orchard that Nils mentioned, the importance of states recognizing that any use of force that does not comply with the general principles on the use of force is in fact a violation of the prohibition of torture and ill treatment, and that recognition doesn't remain in Geneva or New York, that it filters back down to the law enforcement agencies and to the individual members of those law enforcement agencies.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you all. I think for me, the wish also for the Human Rights Council is that we often have issues like police brutality, policing, etc., that fall a little bit between the chairs because there are so many different mandates, but there's not one singular ones. And I do think that we have to make sure that this issue, which is, I think, at the core of human rights at the moment, almost everywhere, has its place in the agenda of the Human Rights Council, that there will be a follow-up to the session or high-level panel, that Nils will continue his work, but also get the colleagues on board, like in the statement of 40 special rapporteurs, that we get into a discussion about what policing has to serve the people. And that there needs to be the council as a facilitator for structural police reforms to prevent torture and that we name. I think this is something, Matthew, you said. Extracustodial torture sounds very abstract. We have to name police brutality where it amounts to torture as torture and sharpen that understanding. So I see that we've built a common ground here, that this is a community to continue working on this. And I thank you all for joining us. I also thank the co-organizers and especially the interpreters and my colleagues who have given me everything I have to say so that I can sound relatively normal to you. So a big thank you to all, and let's continue working on this. This is the beginning, not the end.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias, María.